The man known to history as Thomas Jefferson was born on the 13th of April 1743 at his father's estate of Shadwell in Albemarle County in the Commonwealth of Virginia. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a surveyor and planter who owned several plantations in Virginia, including the tobacco plantation of Shadwell, which he founded in the 1730s, worked by slaves and free laborers. At the time, Virginia was one of the 13 British colonies in North America, but in just over 3 decades, it would become one of the leading states behind the creation of the United States of America, the nation which would call Jefferson one of its most prominent founding fathers. The Jeffersons had been in Virginia since 1612, and Peter was a wealthy and influential member of Virginia society, assuming positions of responsibility as a colonel of the militia and a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. As a surveyor, Thomas's father would find himself charting unknown lands, encountering wild animals on occasion, as well as other dangers. And so the young Thomas looked up to his father as a powerful figure who commanded the respect of his peers. Thomas's mother, Jane Randolph, hailed from Virginia's most prestigious family, a reflection of his father's social standing. The Randolphs first came to Virginia in 1642, and by the 1670s, Jane's grandfather, William Randolph, began to acquire tens of thousands of acres of land, eventually establishing 11 plantations. 9 of William's 10 children survived into adulthood, and the family's wings spread far and wide across the colony, centered on the great mansion at Turkey Hill, near modern-day Richmond. William's third son, Isham Randolph, was a sea captain who moved back and forth between Virginia and London, where his daughter Jane was born in February 1720 in the parish of Shadwell in East London, which would in turn give its name to her husband Peter's plantation after he married her in 1739. The couple would have 6 daughters and 2 sons, of whom Thomas was the eldest. Thomas Jefferson enjoyed a privileged upbringing as part of the Virginia elite, spending his childhood between Shadwell and Tuckahoe, the estate of his mother's late cousin, William Randolph, where the Jeffersons had moved in 1745 so that Peter could manage the estate before moving back to Shadwell in 1752. Peter Jefferson resented the fact that he never had a formal education and chose to send his eldest son to school. At the age of 9, Thomas was sent to live with Reverend William Douglas, a local clergyman who taught him basic French and the classical languages of Latin and Greek. He would later fall under the wing of Reverend James Morey, whose credentials as a classicist were of a higher standard. Under Morey's influence, Jefferson was introduced to classical literature, history, and philosophy of the ancient Greeks and Romans. With this foundation, he left to study classics at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia. By the time Jefferson left for Williamsburg, he was already the official head of his household. His father had died in 1757 when Thomas was 14 years old, leaving behind the memory of a Virginia landed aristocrat in whose steps the son would dutifully follow. As the eldest son, Thomas inherited Shadwell, together with its 66 slaves and more than 2,750 acres of land, although his mother would take on the duties of day-to-day management of the estate. In 1770, a devastating fire left Shadwell in ruins, but Jane was determined to rebuild the house, which would remain the home of 2 further generations of the Jefferson family after Thomas. Thomas's relationship with his mother is difficult to assess since their letters were lost in the fire, but the fact that he continued to live at Shadwell into his adulthood indicates that he and his mother enjoyed a cordial relationship until her death in 1776. At William and Mary, Jefferson not only studied Greek and Latin, but also mathematics under Dr. William Small, a Scottish professor. The distinction between arts and sciences did not yet exist at the time, and Small also taught moral philosophy, and it was during these interactions that Jefferson was introduced to the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers, which had taken hold in 18th century Europe. They believed that human reason rather than any spiritual belief or ancient traditions should be the driving force in the pursuit of truth and the organization of human society. Jefferson was a keen reader and was said to have studied for 15 hours a day, familiarizing himself with the works of the great English scientist Isaac Newton, the political philosopher John Locke, the Scottish philosopher and economist Adam Smith, and many other leading intellectuals. In addition to his academic endeavors, Jefferson also committed to exercising 2 hours a day and was an accomplished violinist who would perform at the governor's palace, where he acquainted himself with the leading political figures of the day, including his cousin Peyton Randolph, who served as the Royal Attorney General, the senior legal officer in the Virginia government. The colonial government was largely controlled by the British Crown, which appointed both the colonial governor and the Council of State, which served as the upper house of the Virginia General Assembly. The lower house, the House of Burgesses, was elected by the free white male population, and it was in this body that Thomas's father Peter had served as the representative of Albemarle County. This arrangement mirrored that of the British political system, with the king or queen exercising power alongside the hereditary House of Lords and the elected House of Commons in a mixed government, which was designed to protect against both royal tyranny and mob rule. Peter Jefferson had considered himself a loyal subject of the king and brought up his son to believe the same. The Virginian aristocratic elite to which the Jeffersons belonged believed that, as British subjects, they had the same political rights in Virginia as their fellow British subjects in Middlesex or Norfolk, but this belief would be shattered in the years following Jefferson's graduation in 1762. After leaving William and Mary, Jefferson spent the next 5 years training to become a lawyer, spending his time between Williamsburg and Shadwell, as tensions steadily increased between the government of Virginia and the authorities in Britain. While Jefferson was a teenager, British armed forces had fought a costly but ultimately victorious war against the French in the 7 Years' War, which lasted between 1754 and 1763. The war was fought over 3 continents, including North America, where it is better known as the French and Indian War. Britain had won a convincing victory in North America, gaining control of all the French colonies in Canada, while the vast province of Louisiana was ceded to Spain in exchange for the British gaining control of Florida. Although the French threat had been eliminated, the 13 colonies continued to face threats from the Native American population, and the British Army chose to maintain a military presence on the frontiers. The British authorities accordingly decided that the North American colonies should share more of the financial burden for their defense, and in 1764 and 1765, Parliament passed a number of measures to raise new taxes from the 13 colonies. On the 9th of March 1764, British Prime Minister George Grenville stood up in the House of Commons and announced the Sugar Act, imposing new duties on the colonies for a range of products. The Prime Minister told members of Parliament that he hoped that the power and sovereignty of Parliament over every part of the British dominions for the purpose of raising or collecting any tax would never be disputed. Grenville's hopes would soon prove to be in vain, as the Sugar Act caused an outcry among the 13 colonies, not least in Virginia, where a resolution was sent to Parliament asserting the principle that people should not be taxed without their consent or those of their representatives, adopting the slogan, "No taxation without representation." These complaints did nothing to prevent the passage of the infamous Stamp Act on the 22nd of March 1765, which levied taxes on all printed material, including paper documents, newspapers, and playing cards. This prompted a further wave of protests and riots across the colonies, many of which were organized by the Sons of Liberty, a political group first established in Boston in August 1765, with branches spreading across the colonies over the course of the following year. Thomas Jefferson was an interested observer of the impassioned debates taking place in the House of Burgesses, and was especially impressed by the oratory of the lawyer Patrick Henry, who called for the most radical measures, though his denunciations of king and parliament were labelled treason by his more moderate colleagues. Despite the fiery rhetoric echoing through the legislatures of Virginia and the other colonies, there was no suggestion even from the likes of Henry that the 13 colonies should break their connection to the British Crown, and certainly no willingness to take up arms in order to do so. By late 1765, Parliament recognised the strength of feeling in the colonies against the Stamp Act and eventually repealed the duties in February 1766, while at the same time passing a declaratory act which asserted the authority of Parliament to make laws binding in the colonies under all circumstances. While Parliament saw the Declaratory Act as a means of saving face, the colonies were far from appeased, and the disputes between North America and Britain were no longer about money, but about political rights and freedom from arbitrary government. Over the following decade, London would repeatedly attempt to assert its authority, and the colonies would repeatedly defy them, until there was no turning back and pens and pamphlets were traded for rifles and muskets. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Jefferson had been admitted to the bar in 1767 and began his legal career living in Shadwell, but traveling to courthouses across Virginia to argue his cases. The following year, on the 15th of December 1768, he was elected as the representative of his native Albemarle County to the House of Burgesses, the first of many offices he would hold in a long and successful political career. Several months earlier, in May 1768, Jefferson decided to build for himself a new house on a hill 2 miles from Shadwell, which he would name Monticello, the Italian for Little Mountain. Built to Jefferson's own design and constantly remodeled to keep up with the latest fashions, Monticello would forever be associated with Jefferson, especially after the devastating fire at Shadwell in 1770, which not only destroyed his library, but also the legal papers he was working on. The fire prompted Jefferson to move to Monticello while the main house was still being built, and it was there that he brought his wife Martha after they married in 1772. Martha Wales Jefferson, known as Patty to her family and close friends, was born in 1748 to a Virginia landowner named John Wales, who was one of Jefferson's clients as a lawyer. Married at the age of 18 and widowed a couple of years later in 1768, Martha became the target of a long line of suitors, including Jefferson. Taking advantage of their mutual love for music, Jefferson enchanted her with his performances on the violin and piano, and the couple were married on New Year's Day 1772. Although the newly married couple would have the occasional argument prompted by Martha's strong personality, she was also one of the only people who could calm her husband's anxieties, which would only grow as the political temperature increased over the coming years. The Jeffersons would prove a loving couple, and they had 6 children together, though only 2 would survive infancy in an era of high childhood mortality. Away from Monticello, London and the colonies continued to trade political blows. On the 16th of December 1773, the Boston branch of the Sons of Liberty sabotaged a shipment of tea from the British East India Company arriving in the harbour, boarding the ship and throwing the valuable cargo into the sea. The event, known to history as the Boston Tea Party, prompted Parliament to pass a package of new punitive measures in 1774, which would collectively be known as the Intolerable Acts. One of these was the Boston Port Act of May 1774, which stipulated that the Port of Boston would remain closed to trade until money was paid to compensate the East India Company for the loss of the cargo. Jefferson and his colleagues in Virginia passed a resolution in solidarity with the Bostonians, and a couple of months later they called for an immediate ban on British imports, asserting that we will ever be ready to join with our fellow subjects in the defense of their constitutional rights. As opposition to the British authorities spread across the colonies, a Continental Congress was scheduled for the 5th of September in Philadelphia. Although Jefferson was not a delegate, he set about writing a set of instructions for Virginia's delegates, which among others included his cousin and former Attorney General Peyton Randolph, Patrick Henry, and a former British Army officer by the name of George Washington, who had played a part in the outbreak of the French and Indian War 20 years earlier. In his pamphlet, under the title A Summary View of the Rights of British America, Jefferson laid out the intellectual justification for the American cause to be treated as the equal of King George's subjects in Europe, pleading to the king to no longer persevere in sacrificing the rights of one part of the empire to the inordinate desires of another, but deal out to all equal and impartial right. At the age of 31, Jefferson's pamphlet made him a political celebrity across the 13 colonies and elevated him to the first rank among the advocates of the American cause, as well as demonstrating his skills as a political writer, which would remain in high demand. By late 1774, it was becoming clear both to the British and the American colonies that they were on the path to civil war. The colonies mobilized their militias to protect themselves against the prospect of a military crackdown by the British authorities, which sought to secure caches of weaponry and ammunition and prevent the colonials from using them. The first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired at Concord and Lexington in Massachusetts on the 19th of April 1775, extinguishing any faint hopes of a reconciliation between Britain and the 13 colonies. The disputes over colonial liberties and the powers of Parliament could only be resolved on the field of battle, either in victory for the British Crown and the reassertion of British authority in America, or in victory for the American rebels and the breaking of all colonial ties with the British Empire. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, with Peyton Randolph as its president. However, when Randolph was summoned back to Williamsburg to preside over the House of Burgesses, Jefferson was sent as his replacement and arrived in Philadelphia on the 11th of June. Now that hostilities had broken out, the Second Continental Congress became a permanent political body to coordinate the war effort among the United Colonies. A few days after Jefferson's arrival in Philadelphia, Congress approved the appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, following a proposal by the Boston lawyer John Adams. Jefferson and Adams would strike up one of the greatest political alliances in American history, and the two men worked closely during the struggle for independence. Unlike Adams, Jefferson was not an accomplished public speaker and preferred to spend his time working behind the scenes in small committees and channeling his mastery of the written word, drafting resolutions, declarations, and reports. By June of 1776, Congress was debating whether to formally declare independence from the British Empire and appointed Adams and Jefferson to draft a declaration for that purpose. Recognizing Jefferson as the superior writer and as a representative from Virginia, the most populous of the colonies, Adams prevailed on his friend to write the first draft, and Jefferson duly set to work on the declaration, seeking inspiration from the Enlightenment thinkers he had read at university. After an introduction which announced the desire to separate from the British Crown, Jefferson set out in the preamble the founding creed of the new nation, the United States of America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Jefferson's preamble was followed by a list of indictments against King George III, as if he were prosecuting a case against the British king in a Virginian court. The strong denunciations of the king ensured that there would be no turning back, since the colonies had previously appealed to the king as their protector blaming his ministers for the unequal treatment of the colonies. After Jefferson's draft was debated by Congress, a number of changes were made in an effort to tone down the criticisms of Britain, and a denunciation of slavery and the slave trade, which appeared in Jefferson's first draft, had also been removed to placate the sensibilities of delegates from the southern states, whose plantation economies were dependent on slave labor. Although disappointed by the changes made to his text, Jefferson could be proud of the fact that when the Declaration of Independence was ratified by Congress on the 4th of July, 1776, it was his words which would echo through the centuries to the present day. Having achieved international renown as the most articulate advocate of American independence, Jefferson longed to return to Virginia. He had encountered a series of personal tragedies over the previous year, including the death of his mother, one of his daughters, and his cousin Peyton Randolph, the giant of Virginia politics. With his wife also in poor health, Jefferson declined the invitation to join a delegation to France to persuade King Louis XVI to join an alliance against the British. While a Franco-American alliance was formalized in February 1778, Jefferson set about reforming Virginia's laws now that the British were no longer in charge, reducing the power of landed elites and widening access to the education system. The cause of religious toleration was particularly close to Jefferson's heart, believing that there was no reason why Christian teachings were any closer to the truth than those of other faiths. While Jefferson's proposals for religious toleration were defeated at the time, they were reintroduced a decade later and adopted. Jefferson also thought hard about the question of slavery. A slaveholder himself who owned over 600 slaves during his life, Jefferson was opposed to the institution on a philosophical level, but did not believe that free whites and free blacks could live together in harmony, and proposed that slaves should be freed and deported once they had reached the age of 21. His fellow landowners in the Virginia government voted down the proposal in order to protect their economic interests, and Jefferson came to accept that the battle over slavery could not be won. The late 1770s were an anxious time for Jefferson and his new country, and it seemed that Washington's Continental Army was hanging by a thread, facing one of the best armies in the world. In late 1778, the British launched a campaign in the South, advancing into Georgia and threatening South Carolina, leaving Virginia vulnerable to attack from the south and east. During this time of great danger, Jefferson was elected governor of Virginia in the summer of 1779. During his 2 years in office, Jefferson played the role of a civilian war leader, putting down loyalist uprisings while also trying to confront attacks by Native Americans on the western frontiers. He also took the momentous decision to move the capital of Virginia from Williamsburg to Richmond, located further inland and less prone to attack from the sea. However, this did not prevent an invasion of Virginia in December 1780, led by Benedict Arnold, the former Continental Army general who had switched sides earlier in the year. Jefferson was slow in mobilizing the Virginia militia and narrowly avoided capture by escaping to the hills above Richmond while Arnold's men sacked the city. Arnold's invasion had been a shock to Jefferson, but worse was to follow. In the spring of 1781, the British forces in the south turned their attention towards Virginia, led by the commander Lord Cornwallis and Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, a dashing but cruel officer who commanded a fearsome cavalry force. In response, Jefferson moved the capital once again to Charlottesville, some 70 miles further inland from Richmond, writing to George Washington asking him to lead reinforcements in person to save Virginia from the British. During the early hours of the 4th of June 1781, as he was preparing to step down as governor, Jefferson was at Monticello when he received news that Tarleton's cavalrymen were riding towards his home with the express purpose of taking him captive. Once again, he managed to escape and narrowly avoided falling into British hands. Tarleton's men are said to have drunk some of Jefferson's wine to toast King George's 43rd birthday, but otherwise Monticello was left intact. After leaving the governor's office, Jefferson faced an inquiry by the General Assembly into his conduct during the previous year. Although cleared of wrongdoing, Jefferson considered his reputation damaged, even after news reached him of Cornwallis's surrender to Washington and his French allies at Yorktown on the 19th of October 1781, prompting the British authorities to agree to peace talks recognizing the independence of the United States. Jefferson's political anguish was soon followed by personal anguish. After giving birth to a daughter in May 1782, Martha Jefferson's health declined rapidly and she was confined to bed. With her husband at her side, she died on the 6th of September 1782 after extracting from him a promise never to remarry. A widower at the age of 39, Thomas Jefferson kept the promise made to his dying wife. But his personal life after Martha's death is one of the darkest and most controversial chapters of his life. Among those at Martha's bedside was a 9-year-old slave girl called Sally Hemings, who happened to be the half-sister of the dying woman, the product of a liaison between John Wales and his mixed-race slave Elizabeth Hemings, which resulted in 10 children, of whom Sally was the youngest. Within a few years, she would go on to play a major but unacknowledged role in Jefferson's personal life. With the loss of his wife and seeking the opportunity to restore his political reputation, in 1783 Jefferson happily accepted an assignment to join the American delegation taking part in peace talks in Paris, but before he could leave, he received news that the American representatives in France had already agreed the terms of a draft treaty with Great Britain, which offered extremely generous terms to the United States in order to isolate her French and Spanish allies. Instead, on the 6th of June 1783, Jefferson was elected to represent Virginia at the Continental Congress, a weak political body that delegated significant powers to the states. Jefferson was convinced that Congress had to be strengthened in order to avoid the prospect of the states fighting against each other. The body even struggled to reach a quorum of 9 states to ratify the Treaty of Paris, only doing so on the 14th of January 1784. On the 5th of July 1784, after spending less than a year in Congress, Jefferson finally had the chance to go to France as the ambassador of the peacetime United States of America. He had been an admirer of France ever since she chose to ally herself with the United States during the Revolutionary War, and he was determined to strengthen the French alliance in order to guarantee American security in case the British were to try to retake their former colonies. Arriving on the 31st of July with his daughter Patsy and a small party of servants, Jefferson would remain in France until September 1789. As well as carrying out his diplomatic duties by negotiating a number of trade agreements, Jefferson inserted himself into Parisian society and met with some of the greatest political thinkers of the age. He struck up a friendship with Thomas Paine, the radical English writer whose best-selling pamphlet, Common Sense, had been a major factor in encouraging popular support for independence in 1776. He would go on to write The Rights of Man in 1791 and The Age of Reason in 1795, powerful denunciations of monarchy and religion, which echoed Jefferson's own views on the subject. But while Paine the writer could set out his ideal vision of society and government, Jefferson the statesman and politician had to be more pragmatic. During his 5-year stay, Jefferson witnessed France's gradual descent into revolution. King Louis XVI's government was heavily indebted by military expenditures, partly incurred as a result of French participation in the American Revolutionary War against Britain. Despite widespread hunger and poverty among the ordinary French people, the powerful and wealthy nobility and Catholic Church did not agree to pay additional taxes to improve the condition of the poor. With his coffers almost empty and running out of other options, the king reluctantly summoned the Estates General, an ancient political body with representatives from the church, the nobility, and the commoners, which had once served as a source of advice to the monarch but had not been called for more than a century and a half. The election of representatives to the Estates General led to a large number of proposals to improve the French political system and ensure that it was more responsive to the needs of the common people. Jefferson followed the course of events closely and welcomed the prospect of the end of royal absolutism in France. While in Paris, Jefferson continued to keep an eye on political events back home in the United States. Between the 25th of May and the 17th of September 1787, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in order to establish a stronger central government. While Jefferson had lamented that the existing national institutions were too weak, his experiences in France caused him to worry that the central government might be too strong and tend towards tyranny. There were even rumors that one of the sons of King George III might be invited to the United States to serve as a constitutional monarch, and many delegates still believed that the British political system was an example to follow. When he read the draft constitution, Jefferson welcomed the separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, respectively the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court. However, he was concerned about the office of President, since although there were elections every 4 years, the holder of that office could theoretically remain there for life. He was also disappointed that there was no Declaration of Rights to protect the rights of individuals and states against the federal government. Although he recognized it as an imperfect document, Jefferson believed it could be improved upon with amendments over time, and a Bill of Rights was later drawn up as a package of 10 amendments to the Constitution, even before its ratification on the 21st of June 1788. In July 1787, Jefferson was reunited with his younger daughter Polly, whom he had not seen for 3 years. She was accompanied by Sally Hemings, around 14 years old and bearing a strong resemblance to her late half-sister Martha Jefferson. The relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings remains a controversial subject, but it is likely that they were involved in a sexual relationship from 1788 or 1789. Since Sally was pregnant when Jefferson prepared to return to the United States in the summer of 1789. She had initially refused to accompany him, knowing that she could apply for her liberty in France and live as a free woman, with far greater prospects compared to returning across the Atlantic and living the rest of her life as an enslaved woman. Eventually, she agreed to return on the condition that her children would be freed from slavery at the age of 21. Thomas Jefferson, one of the most powerful men in the United States, was forced to make concessions to a mixed-race girl no older than 16. Sally gave birth shortly after their return to Virginia, but the child did not live long. She had 5 more children with Jefferson, 4 of whom would survive into adulthood. Jefferson only freed them formally after his death in his will, but those who had reached 21 were allowed to leave Monticello. In spite of his concessions to Sally and his personal belief that slavery was immoral, the uncomfortable fact remains that the man who had declared so eloquently that all men are created equal kept his own children as slaves. While largely accurate rumors about their liaison were spread by Jefferson's opponents in the United States later in his political career, the relationship was unacknowledged and was only confirmed by DNA testing in the year 2000. Jefferson's final months in France coincided with the French Revolution. The Estates General could still not decide on the proper procedure for its deliberations, and the Third Estate, representing the commoners, declared itself the National Assembly. Royal authority melted away in the face of widespread rioting and protests, and the National Assembly became the effective government of France after the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July 1789. Jefferson was a close friend of many of the National Assembly's leaders, including the Marquis de Lafayette, the French general who had served alongside Washington in the Revolutionary War and was present at the British surrender at Yorktown. At the time, Lafayette was perhaps the most popular person in France, serving as commander of the National Guard, whilst also responsible for keeping order in Paris and for protecting the king and the royal family from the more radical elements of the revolution. Jefferson collaborated with Lafayette on drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which was adopted by the National Assembly on the 26th of August. This key document served as a statement of the values of the revolution and opened with the assertion that human beings are born and remain free and equal in rights, echoing Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. After making his contribution to French politics, Jefferson left France at the end of September 1789 and arrived back in Virginia on the 23rd of November. He had intended to return to Paris to resume his ambassadorial duties the following year, but in December he was offered the post of Secretary of State by George Washington, who had been unanimously elected president under the new Constitution and had taken office on the 30th of April 1789. As Secretary of State, Jefferson was to be the president's chief foreign policy advisor, a role he was suited to given his experience in France. He accepted the invitation and left Virginia for New York, then the seat of federal government, and took up his post in March 1790. Although Jefferson's office was primarily concerned with foreign affairs, as a member of Washington's cabinet, he was also involved in the debates concerning the future political development of the United States. The Washington administration was dominated by the Federalists, a group who believed that a strong federal government was essential for national prosperity and security. Jefferson's old friend, John Adams, Washington's vice president, was one of the leaders of the Federalist Party, and the president himself was sympathetic to this position. Its chief advocate was the 34-year-old Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, a New York lawyer who had served as the senior staff officer at Washington's headquarters during the Revolutionary War and was one of the president's closest associates. After the end of the war, Hamilton wrote most of the Federalist Papers, a series of essays calling for more power to be concentrated in the federal government rather than the states, which led to the Constitutional Convention and the adoption of the Constitution of 1789. Jefferson was opposed to the Federalist position and described himself as a Democratic Republican, defending the rights of the states and the individual against that of the federal authorities. He believed that Hamilton was promoting the interests of commercial elites in the North at the expense of the poor farmers of the South. Jefferson considered Hamilton his main political rival, and a man whose vision of government would create the conditions for the kind of tyranny that the country had recently thrown off. Hamilton proposed the creation of a national bank to manage the national debt, enabling Congress to raise finances for government expenditures. He also suggested consolidating state debts into a national debt, in effect granting the federal government the power of taxation to pay off those debts. These proposals were supported by heavily indebted northern states, such as Massachusetts, and Hamilton's native New York, but opposed by southern states such as Virginia and North Carolina, which had managed their finances more prudently. Thanks to the influence of Jefferson's political ally and fellow Virginian James Madison, the measure was defeated in the House of Representatives in April 1790. Keen to break the deadlock in Congress, Jefferson and Hamilton came to a deal. Hamilton's proposals were allowed to pass, but in return the federal capital would be moved from the northern commercial center of New York to a purpose-built city further south on a parcel of land known as the District of Columbia by the banks of the Potomac River. The arguments over domestic policy spilled over into foreign policy. Adams and Hamilton were keen to repair relations with Great Britain, since they still regarded the British Constitution as the ideal form of government. Jefferson, on the other hand, favoured closer relations with revolutionary France. However, from September 1792, the revolution had turned bloodier as members of the radical Jacobin Club seized control of the National Assembly, forcing Lafayette to go into exile in fear for his life. In 1793, the Jacobin leader Maximilien Robespierre unleashed a reign of terror which saw thousands of Frenchmen and women go to the guillotine, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Even though the Federalists' warning about anarchy seemed to be justified, Jefferson did not abandon his support for France and the Revolution. In his mind, to do so would be to abandon the ideals of the American Revolution. Therefore, when the French Republic declared war on Britain on the 1st of February 1793, Jefferson privately protested against Washington's proclamation of neutrality, But the Secretary of State's pro-French cause was undermined by the visit of a French envoy, Edmond Charles Genet, who insulted Washington and tried to provoke the Americans into hostilities against Britain. By late 1793, the political tensions between Jefferson and Hamilton reached breaking point. Both men told the president of their intention to resign from office. Although Washington succeeded in having Hamilton stay on, he reluctantly accepted Jefferson's resignation on New Year's Day 1794. For the next 2 years, Jefferson lived in Monticello with his family in semi-retirement, spending much of his time remodeling the house to a grander Italian design. Although he wrote to his friends and acquaintances about feeling liberated at no longer being at the center of the political debates, he continued to receive updates from political allies about the latest developments in domestic and international policy. For Jefferson and the Republicans, the signs were not good. Keen to avoid war with Britain, Washington had dispatched Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a treaty. Signed in November 1794, the ensuing Jay Treaty strengthened the trading relationship between Britain and the United States, being welcomed by the Federalists while infuriating the Republicans. The terms of the treaty also outraged France, and it seemed as though Washington's desire to prevent a war with Britain might provoke a war with France. After a bitter political battle, the treaty was ratified by the Senate in August 1795 and went into effect the following February, though it was only by the end of April 1796 that Congress granted funding to the federal government to fulfill its treaty obligations after a knife-edge vote. Following this political setback, and with Washington's second term drawing to a close, the Republicans looked among themselves for a challenger to the presidency. There was only one possible option. On the 19th of September 1796, President Washington published his farewell address, signaling his intention to retire from public life and not to seek a third presidential term. By limiting himself to 2 terms, Washington set a strong precedent which would only be broken once in the next 200 years, and Jefferson's concerns about a presidency for life did not come to pass. In his farewell address, Washington urged the country to remain united and warned against the spirit of party, which he argued would be a permanent source of political instability and create the conditions for a despot to emerge promising order and stability. Washington witnessed how the disagreements between Jefferson and Hamilton threatened to break his administration apart, but his warnings went unheeded, and Washington's retirement led to the first competitive presidential election in American history. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans went into the election with their preferred candidates. The former supported John Adams for president, while the latter backed Jefferson. Under the constitutional arrangements of the time, the president was chosen by a college of electors, each of whom would have 2 votes. The candidate with the highest number of votes would be elected president, provided he received the support of more than 50% of electors. The runner-up would become vice president. If the top 2 were tied, a vote in the House of Representatives would determine the winner. In most states, the electors would be chosen by the state legislatures, and only in a handful of states were they chosen by a popular vote. The electors usually made it public who they would be voting for in the Electoral College. There was no campaigning as such, and everything depended on political networks and mobilizing support behind the scenes. After the votes were tallied, Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson 71 votes to 68. On the 4th of March 1797, John Adams took office as the second President of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson became his vice president. The president and vice president had been close friends and collaborators during the Revolutionary years, but the disagreements between the Federalists and the Republicans had caused them to drift apart. The fear of war with either Britain or France created a sense of permanent crisis in American politics, which threatened the very existence of the young nation. In the spring of 1798, Adams revealed that an American mission to France had failed when 3 French officials, codenamed X, Y, and Z, demanded bribes and an apology for signing the Jay Treaty in order to resume cordial relations. It was widely suspected that one of the officials in question was the skillful but notoriously corrupt French Foreign Minister Charles-Maurice Talleyrand. The French demands may have been a standard request in European diplomatic negotiations, but the Americans felt insulted, and Jefferson recognized that once again the actions of the French government had undermined his political position. President Adams prepared for war, and in July 1798, the so-called quasi-war broke out, an undeclared war which saw French attacks on American shipping. In order to protect national security, Adams introduced a series of laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which gave the president the power to deport resident foreigners considered a national security risk, while making it illegal to publish anything which defamed the United States and its government. Although Jefferson's worst fears about despotic government were coming true, he was Adams' vice president and unable to attack the government directly. But behind the scenes, he encouraged his supporters to criticize the Alien and Sedition Acts in the press and advise state governments on how to resist the federal laws. Jefferson's tenure as vice president was an unhappy one, finding himself in the awkward position of being the de facto leader of the opposition to an administration he served in. In 1800, the government moved from its temporary home of Philadelphia to its permanent seat in the city of Washington, named after the first president, who had died on the 14th of December 1799. It was also election year, and Adams and Jefferson geared up for a rematch of their contest 4 years earlier. The election of 1800 proved to be one of the most dramatic in the history of the United States. In the spring of that year, thanks to the influence of Senator Aaron Burr of New York, Jefferson's preferred candidate for vice president in the coming presidential election, the Republicans were able to win a majority in the New York legislature, which would in turn lead to New York appointing electors voting for the Republican ticket in the presidential election, and by early December 1800, Jefferson was quietly confident that he would succeed Adams as president. However, when all the results came in, Jefferson and Burr were tied on 73 votes each, and it was up to the House of Representatives to decide whether Jefferson or Burr would become president. As the Federalists continued to have a majority in the House, the Republicans were afraid that they might cancel the election altogether. This was far-fetched, but at the very least, it gave them an opportunity to cause mischief and split the Republicans by voting for Burr and denying the presidency to Jefferson, their most prominent opponent, and Jefferson himself began to suspect the ambitions of his running mate. The House met on the 11th of February 1801 to break the tie between Jefferson and Burr. For 6 days, the House was unable to make a decision, while political negotiations between Jefferson and the Federalists took place behind closed doors. The Federalists were prepared to make Jefferson president if he promised not to dismiss all the Federalist office holders and replace them with his own men, and if he would maintain the public debt and the Department of the Navy, both Federalist institutions established during the Washington and Adams years. But Jefferson refused to be tied down to any conditions. Nevertheless, on the 17th of February, Jefferson was eventually elected president on the 36th ballot, after several Federalists switched their vote in his favor. It appears that Jefferson owed the presidency to an unexpected source in the form of Alexander Hamilton, who had opposed both Adams and Jefferson in the election. He was able to persuade several Federalists to switch their vote. He believed that Jefferson's pragmatism and his existing record in office was preferable to Burr, whom he knew through New York politics and regarded as an unprincipled and self-serving individual. The clash between Hamilton and Burr would eventually lead to the two men fighting a duel in 1804, in which Hamilton was killed. At noon on the 4th of March 1801, Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he appealed for unity among the warring factions. Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have been called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. The appeal to moderation was well received. Those Federalists who feared that Jefferson might dismantle the federal institutions created by his predecessors were mistaken. though Jefferson did appoint key Republican allies to his cabinet. As Secretary of State, the new president appointed James Madison, his Virginia protege, who had been a source of political advice for almost 30 years, while the Pennsylvanian Republican Albert Gallatin, a prominent leader of the opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts in the House of Representatives, was named Secretary of the Treasury. During his 8 years in the presidency, Jefferson would scale down federal obligations, reducing the national debt from $83 million to $57 million, and cutting military spending to pre-war levels. He did not believe it was worthwhile to participate in an arms race with the European great powers, and preferred to remain neutral in their wars with each other. Jefferson's presidency is mostly associated with America's westward expansion. Although he had never ventured west of Virginia, as a child he had been drawn to his father's experiences at the western frontier. The leaders of the early American Republic shared the anxiety that the European powers in North America, primarily Britain and Spain, as well as the Indian tribes, would try to prevent America's westward expansion beyond the Mississippi River. Indeed, these worries increased with the Third Treaty of San Ildefonso of October 1800, a secret Franco-Spanish agreement whereby Spain agreed to give France the sizable Louisiana territory west of the Mississippi in exchange for some Italian lands under French control. France's leader at the time was First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte, the revolutionary general who had seized power in November 1799 and put an end to 10 years of political instability in Paris. While Napoleon seemed keen to create a new North American empire, the prospect appalled Jefferson. As the important port of New Orleans, the economic lifeline of the southern states, would fall under French control. To prevent this from happening and to secure the national interest, the Francophile Jefferson was even prepared to ally with Britain. Before that, however, he would offer to buy New Orleans from Napoleon. The president entrusted James Monroe with the delicate task of handling these negotiations alongside the American ambassador in Paris, Robert Livingston. Monroe had recently been governor of Virginia and had been a close friend of Jefferson and Madison's since the 1780s. Developments in early 1803 made the sale of New Orleans attractive to Napoleon, as the uneasy peace between France and Britain signed at Amiens in March 1802 seemed destined to collapse, with both sides blaming the other for failing to comply with its terms. Furthermore, Napoleon's ambitions in the Americas had been thwarted in the former French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, where a military force he sent to crush the slave uprising had been decimated by yellow fever. Unable to retake the richest colony in the Caribbean, and with Louisiana vulnerable to potential British attack, Napoleon decided to cash in and proposed selling the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. Monroe and Livingston signed the treaty at the end of April, even though they had only been authorized to buy New Orleans for $10 million. News of the treaty was announced on the 4th of July 1803, the 27th anniversary of independence, and the Louisiana Purchase was ratified by Congress in October. Jefferson was widely acclaimed for his deal-making, but opponents claimed that he had acted unconstitutionally since Congress had only allocated $10 million for the purchase. Indeed, Jefferson himself may have had reservations about the expansion of executive power had he not been the president. Overnight, the United States of America had more than doubled in size. In fact, neither the French nor the American negotiators of the purchase had any precise idea where its borders were. Early in 1803, President Jefferson had already received congressional approval for an expedition to the Pacific to survey and document the Western Territories, and appointed as its leader his secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis, a Virginian veteran of the Revolutionary War. In the summer, Lewis invited fellow Virginia native Lieutenant William Clark to be co-leader of the expedition, and as both men made their preparations and recruited men into their corps of discovery, Jefferson gave instructions to explore the newly acquired Louisiana Territory. Departing from St. Louis on the Mississippi in the spring of 1804, Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific coast in November 1805, completing the round trip by September 1806. Jefferson and the wider American public followed news of the expedition with great interest, reading accounts of their encounters with Indian tribes and the natural landscapes that confronted them on their journey, prompting the president to set aside a room in the presidential mansion to display a collection of natural artifacts sent to him by Lewis and Clark. For Jefferson, these Western territories represented new opportunities for the American people to cultivate the lands, reflecting his ideal of an agrarian republic. Jefferson had won widespread popularity during his first term by lowering taxes and signing the Louisiana Purchase, and while his Federalist opponents remained vocal in the press, he handsomely won re-election in 1804 with 162 electoral votes to 14. The Federalists' position was so weak that Jefferson was more concerned about opposition from his own side, including those Republicans who claimed that Jefferson had compromised too much with the Federalist cause. A further concern came in the form of Vice President Aaron Burr, who had killed Alexander Hamilton in an infamous duel on the 11th of July 1804. The killing of Hamilton, who was widely mourned and celebrated as one of the chief architects of the United States government, ended Burr's political career, and Jefferson picked George Clinton of New York as his running mate for vice president in the 1804 election. Jefferson was happy to be rid of Burr, but in 1806, rumors reached him that his former vice president was planning on leading a military force, either to take control of Louisiana or Spanish Mexico, or even to overthrow the government in Washington. Jefferson had his congressional allies introduce measures to allow the president to use federal troops to quell internal insurrections, another measure he would surely have opposed had he not been president. Jefferson accused Burr of treason and gave orders for his arrest. The former vice president was detained in March 1807 and put on trial, for which he was eventually acquitted. As Jefferson was busy dealing with domestic security, the prospect of war with Britain once again reared its head in June 1807, after the British ship HMS Leopard opened fire on the USS Chesapeake when the latter refused a British request to search the ship for deserters. The act outraged American public opinion, and Jefferson was prepared to declare war. However, he knew that the United States was in no position to fight a naval war with Britain. Instead, on the 22nd of December 1807, he signed the Embargo Act into law, forbidding American trade not only with Britain, but all foreign countries. Although the embargo prevented war and stimulated the development of American industry to replace imported goods, the policy led to higher prices for food and other basic necessities and proved highly unpopular. In a turning of the tables, the Federalists were now protesting about President Jefferson's executive power, though Jefferson's preferred successor, James Madison, easily won the 1808 presidential election. After leaving the presidency, Thomas Jefferson returned to Monticello on the 15th of March 1809, where he would spend the remaining 17 years of his life. The 65-year-old former president enjoyed playing with his grandchildren and attended to their every need. As for his children, with Sally Hemings, who were similar in age, Jefferson treated them the same as all his other slaves. And while visitors to Monticello would remark privately on how some of the slaves bore a striking resemblance to the master of the house, Jefferson would never pay attention to such talk. He basked in the glow of a respectable elder statesman in his hilltop retreat, full of reminders of yesteryear, including busts and portraits of his fellow founding fathers, Washington, Adams, even Hamilton, a surprise to many visitors who had witnessed their bitter rivalry. At the encouragement of some friends, and far removed from the political fights of the 1790s, Jefferson was happy to resume his correspondence and friendship with John Adams, as the two men reminisced about the past and shared their hopes and anxieties for the future of the nation. In 1812, the same year the two men resumed their correspondence, the war between Great Britain and the United States, which Jefferson had tried to avoid, had finally broken out. Although British troops burned Washington, D.C. in August 1814, The final peace settlement restored the pre-war status quo, and the United States was safe for the time being, secure from external enemies. By the end of the decade, disagreements over whether Missouri should be admitted to the Union as a free state or a slave state threatened to tear the nation apart once again. Writing to Adams, Jefferson could see that the question of slavery was a far greater threat to unity than any of their political battles. But while Jefferson continued writing and thinking about slavery in the twilight of his life, this was a political battle to be fought by future generations of politicians. For this very purpose, he founded the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in 1819, hoping that it would nurture political leaders in the values of liberty and freedom, which he held dear. After 1820, Jefferson's health was in steady decline, although in 1824 the 81-year-old was still able to meet his old friend Lafayette, who was visiting the United States on a farewell tour, receiving great acclaim everywhere he went and catching up with his old revolutionary comrades, including the 88-year-old John Adams. In 1826, the 50th anniversary of independence, neither Adams nor Jefferson were in a condition to join in the celebrations in Washington, and by the end of June, both were gravely ill. On the 4th of July, John Adams died at 6 o'clock in the evening at his Massachusetts home, at 90 years old. The dying man's final words to those gathered around his bedside recalled his friend and rival. Thomas Jefferson survives. Unbeknownst to him, the 83-year-old Jefferson had died at 1 in the afternoon, 50 years to the day after his Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Continental Congress. Thomas Jefferson is routinely considered one of the greatest statesmen in the history of the United States. Born a subject of the British Empire, his political views radicalized over time, and by his early 30s, he had written one of the most consequential documents in world history, a powerful statement of universal human rights and liberties, which continues to inspire the defenders of freedom against dictators and despots around the world to this day. He dominated American politics for half a century, serving as Secretary of State and Vice President before climbing to the highest office in the land. As president, he doubled the size of the United States of America, not through conquest, but through diplomacy, opening up new lands and economic opportunities for the American people. Throughout his life, he defended the rights of the individual against the threat of a tyrannical state. His house at Monticello is a site of pilgrimage for many Americans and attracts 500,000 visitors a year. Yet the universal human rights so eloquently preached by Jefferson did not apply within the walls of his Monticello estate. Since DNA testing has given strong evidence that Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings' children, he has been labeled a hypocrite, especially among African Americans. He may have opposed slavery in principle, but he was happy enough to keep his children as slaves, and only set them free as part of the agreement he made with their mother in France. Unlike Washington, who freed all his slaves in his will, nearly all of Jefferson's slaves remained in bondage at his death. Historical figures should be judged by the standards of their time, but in Jefferson's time, there were plenty of Americans who opposed slavery both in private and in public. He had the foresight to recognize that slavery could tear apart the Union. But while he was prepared to fight political battles against his former friends in defense of the individual rights of white Americans, he was happy to keep slaves at Monticello, and while in national office, made no effort to encourage his political base in the slave-holding South to give up their slaves. Indeed, Jefferson's famous words in the Declaration of Independence, stating that it was self-evident that all men were created equal, would prove to be problematic due to the fact that slavery perpetuated across numerous states for nearly a century after the Declaration. This is the contradiction at the heart of the Declaration of Independence, that the implicit message conveyed by it was that only white men were created equal. What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? Was he the great statesman who championed individual liberty against tyrannical regimes and charted America's path to greatness? Or was he a hypocrite whose talk of rights and liberties was merely intended to protect the wealth and prosperity of the Virginia slave-holding class to which he belonged? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.